Holt, Ken Vabar, Zeke Flores. Is there anybody on the other end hearing the sound of my voice whose name did not get called? Okay, I'll try to keep an eye out in case anybody joins. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Okay, we now have volume. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. We are here for our second to last session in the book of Judges. With luck, we will finish the actual text tonight, but I wouldn't bet on it. This particular story covers 3 chapters, so we're going to have to slap this thing in B for boogie and roll. All right, let me hold on. Try to get my share screen up here. Okay.
David?
Yes.
Are you doing better than last week?
That's an interesting question. I'm not entirely sure. I've been running so fast, I haven't stopped to ask. I'll get an opinion from my doctor. I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. I'm thankful to be with you, thankful to be alive, and thankful that Jesus is Lord.
Amen. All
right, we are in the second conclusion to the book of Judges. You're off the team, Dave. Inside joke. This puts us in Judges chapter 19. You may recall, those of you who were here last time, that we looked at a chillingly sad story that involved a man named Micah and his mother and 1,100 pieces of stolen silver, and then came to involve a Levite, and then came to involve the entire tribe of Dan. It was really a story about Dan. It just started with minor players and became the story about a tribe. A very sad story because the whole tribe wound up moving off into creating their own shrine, their own holy place, and worshiping God via the means of an idol. Very tragic. This story that concludes the book of Judges is also about a tribe, not the tribe of Dan, but the tribe of Benjamin. There are quite a lot of parallels between this story and the last. There are lots of little links that kind of weave these two stories together. We'll try to notice them as we go along. Let's take a moment to pray as we enter into this. Father, our heart's desire to know you and to know truth and to be enlightened by your Holy Spirit. We ask you, Spirit, to make application of your holy word into our lives, individually and collectively, that we may be yours. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, Judges 19, verse 1. In those days when there was no king in Israel, there's the first link to our last story. Twice in the last story, chapters 17 and 18, we read, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In one time, that was the full statement. The other time, it was simply there was no king in Israel. In this story, there are going to be 2 instances of the same thing. One time, it will say just there was no king in Israel. The other time, just like the last story, it will say, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So one other thing to notice, by the way, with these 2 stories is, as we went through the Judges, there was a sense of a timeline continuing in a linear chronology. You know, this judge would be followed by 40 years of peace, and then another judge would arise, and then he would die, and then another judge would arise. And so there was a sense of time flowing linearly from earlier in the story to later in the story without interruptions. That's pretty much true for the entire middle section of the book where you have the major judges. But the 2 stories here at the end are not clearly linked by any time indicator. So we don't know exactly when during the period of Judges that the Danites were looking for their new home, or that the events that happened to the tribe of Benjamin occurred in this story. There are some indications that these stories actually may have happened earlier in the period of Judges. We will note the reasons why as we go. I just wanted to mention that because the natural assumption would be, okay, we had all those judges, then Samson, the last judge, died, and then these things happened here. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. These stories do picture the very low point of the devolution of the morals and the ethic standing of the people. But the people lived in 12 different tribes in different communities, and they were not linked by internet or apps or social media. And so the story of what was going on spiritually in the life of one part of the country or another might be very, very different. Okay, in those days when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah and was there some 4 months. All right, already we have links to the preceding story. In that story, a certain nameless Levite came from, would you guess it, Bethlehem in Judah, where he could not make a living, as it turned out, and he wound his way up into the hill country of Ephraim, where he came to the house of a man named Micah. Well, here we have a story of a Levite who begins not in Bethlehem, but in the hill country of Ephraim, where Micah lived, and he takes a wife, actually a slave wife, a concubine, from Bethlehem. The same pairing of cities that we saw in our last story. Unfortunately, the marriage did not go well, and the concubine, it says, was unfaithful to him. You might notice that in the ancient versions, there's a little bit of a different rendering here. Instead of it saying that she played the prostitute, which is what the word in the Masoretic, in the original Hebrew text means, in the Old Latin and in the Septuagint, which is the original Greek translation, the term is that she was angry with him or she quarreled with him. So the term unfaithful here might not necessarily mean that she was sexually unfaithful. It could simply mean that she left him. After all, the law of Moses does not really give a woman an option for divorce. A man could divorce his wife. It does not say that the wife could initiate the same procedure. So what would she do? She would up and leave. And that's what this one did. She up and left. She went home to daddy back in Bethlehem. And she was gone for some 4 months. Verse 3, then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys. And she brought him into her father's house. And when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. Well, this seems amicable enough. You know, maybe whatever the quarrel was about, 4 months later, they're ready to make up. Their hearts maybe have turned, and there's the possibility of tenderness again. So he's gone back to try to woo her and to win her back and to patch things up. They're in Bethlehem. And the girl's father, the father-in-law to the Levite, is very overjoyed. He greets him with tremendous hospitality. Verse 4. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and spent the night there. And on the 4th day, they arose early in the morning, and he, the Levite, prepared to go. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread, and after that you may go. Evidently, it took him all day to eat that slice of bread. So the two of them sat and ate and drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, be pleased to spend the night and let your heart be merry. And when the man rose up to go, his father-in-law pressed him till he spent the night there again. So he stayed 3 days out of common courtesy. He was planning to go on the 4th day, got suckered into sitting down for another meal, and the day progressed, and the father-in-law said, oh, not at this hour. Come, go ahead and spend the night. You can get an early start tomorrow. So he spends the night for the 4th day, verse 8. And on the 5th day, he arose early in the morning to depart. And the girl's father said, strengthen your heart and wait until the day declines. So they ate, both of them. I have an idea that the Levites putting on pretty good weight because they're doing a lot of eating. Verse 9. And when the man and his concubine and his servant rose to depart, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, Behold, now the day is waning toward evening. Please spend the night. Behold, the day draws to its close. Lodge here and let your heart be merry. And tomorrow you shall arise early in the morning for your journey and go home. At this point, the Levites just had about enough of this routine. I mean, the father-in-law is overly courteous, but he's getting the feeling that he's never going to be able to get away. So, verse 10, but the man would not spend the night. He rose up and departed, and he arrived opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. So even though it's late in the day on day number 5, and the father-in-law presses him, oh, look, it's gotten late. Why don't you wait and get an early start? And he says, no, we're long past due. It's time for us to go. And so they left. There is a lot of ink that is spilled in the sequence of the father-in-law's hospitality. And I think something is going on. Rhonda, go ahead. I see.
Yes, sir. I just wanted to ask, I guess I'm missing something. The definition of the difference between a concubine and a wife, since it's saying father-in-law as if they're married.
Yes, a concubine was considered to be a wife. The difference was she was a slave woman as opposed to a free woman, which meant that her status in the household would be less than that of a wife that was a free woman. She would be a wife, but she would still be a slave.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So, for instance, if a man had, and polygamy was practiced by some during this time, if a man, say, had 2 wives that were full wives, and that is free women, and then he had a concubine, the concubine would definitely be at the bottom of the pecking order in the household.
Thank you.
Surely. Now, there's something going on with all this detail, and I am not at all satisfied that I understand what it is. I do want to read you a comment that was made by a commentator on this. Let me see if I can find where that is.
Brother David, can I ask a quick question?
Go ahead.
Is it possible that the Levite from the last story is the same Levite again?
Actually, no. And the reason I can tell you that is that just like in the last story, his name was withheld. You might remember till the very final line. Yes. In this story, the Levite also does get named, but it didn't happen for a lot of verses away from here.
Okay. Thank you.
And it's a different name. So these are different guys. However, the weird thing about this story is the only person in this entire story that involves a cast of hundreds of people, only one person in the entire story gets a name. Everybody else is anonymous. Isn't that weird? And there's a reason for that too, by the way. We might even get to it tonight, maybe. We'll see how it goes. All right, one thing that's going on here, according to scholars, is that we're about to come to a part of the story that is very, very inhospitable. And the commentators say that the excessive hospitality that the concubine's father shows the Levite is kind of a foil. It serves as a backdrop for contrast to what's about to happen in the story, which I will not give away. But the second thing is, there is a scholar named Fockelman who correctly observes that much space is given to enjoying hospitality. And at first, the reader wonders what all this trivial hospitality has to do with the crime that is coming and its horrors. The answer is that the story signifies how much the Levite is attached to, quote, carousing. To enjoy oneself is the Hebrew term. And that such hedonism and materialism lead to a situation in which the crime will take place. In other words, the only thing you had to do to get this Levite's attention was to put out some food and drink. He was really into eating and drinking. He was really into carousing. We'll see this is not the last time in the story that he does that. So maybe the excessive emphasis on, let's have another meal, let's drink another jug, let's sit down at the pub, is to get this, is to cast the character of the Levite in this kind of a light. He'll do anything, kind of like preachers and fried chicken, as the story goes. If you want to fish for a preacher, put fried chicken on your line. There you go. But day 5, the Levites had enough. Even though it's late in the day, he saddles up the donkeys and off they go. Verse 11. When they were near Jebus, the day was nearly over, and the servant said to his master, "Come now, let us turn aside to this city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." And his master said to him, "No, we will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel." That's funny. The picture's not showing on the screen up here.
It comes and goes.
Okay. One moment. Try one more thing here. Belly didn't work, what it won't. So they, it was late in the day, and the servant says, "Here's the city. Let's seek, shelter there." And the master says, "Not with them foreigners." That would be like somebody from A&M not wanting to take a motel in Lubbock. Know what I mean, Vern? Don't know if we can trust those Lubbock guys. They vote for the wrong team. The Jebusites, by the way, were not Canaanites. Evidently, they were ethnically from some other branch, but they were not, like in Africa, in the area where we lived and where I grew up, nearly all the tribes were Bantu peoples. That is, they all came from the same general roots. They all kind of looked alike. They spoke languages that were closely related. But every once in a while, you'd run into a tribe that looked different and sounded different, and their language was totally different because they came from a different genealogical stream. They were not Bantu. So there were lots of Canaanites and Amorites and other ites that were kind of related here, but the Jebusites were weirdos. They were a different breed. And their city was Jerusalem. It was Jebus, but that was what Jerusalem was called long ago. So, verse 12, his master said to him, "We will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah." And he said to his young man, "Come, let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or at Ramah." These would be 2 cities in the Benjaminite region or close to it that they were not too far away from, a few kilometers away still. So, verse 14, they passed on and went their way. And the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. And they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in, that would be the Levite, and sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. Now, this is not surprising to us because we have a very different culture. But let me tell you guys something. Motel 6 would have had a hard time making a go of it in ancient Israel, because the common courtesy of the East was that if a stranger came into a town and sat down in the public center, somebody would invite him home. He didn't have to look for Motel 6. It was unheard of, essentially, for people not to do this. Now, there is one other story in Scripture where this happens, where 2 guys show up in a town and they sit down in the city square and nobody invites them home. It's in Genesis. It's a story of 2 angels coming to Sodom. Until finally, Lot's coming in and he sees them and he says, "You don't really want to spend the night here under the stars. Come home with me." And we're going to get a repeat of that. Verse 16, "And behold, an old man was coming from his work in the field at evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was sojourning in Gibeah. The men of the place were Benjaminites. Benjamin's going to get a real black eye in this particular story. Notice that all the people in the town, that it belongs to the tribe of Benjamin, so all the people are Benjaminites, and none of them are exercising hospitality. None of them are showing the basic courtesy that would be expected of fellow Israelites. And the only man who does is a man who's living there, but he's an Ephraimite. He's not even a Benjaminite. Verse 17. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, "Where are you going? And where do you come from?" And he said to him, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to the house of the Lord, but no one has taken me into his house. We have straw and feed for our donkeys, with bread and wine for me and your female servant, and the young man with your servants. There is no lack of anything." What he's basically saying is, you don't have to feed us. You don't have to water us. All we're looking for is a bed. I mean, we are no muss, no fuss. We are low, what's the term?
Maintenance.
Low maintenance. Thank you. Had a momentary brain collapse there. Low maintenance will be easy. At this point, he'll settle for anything. And the old man said, "Shalom." He said, "Peace to you. I will care for all your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square." Notice the word "only" here. Lot says something very similar. You do not want to spend the night in the square. Dave, I remember, you and I, we both lived on the outskirts of a large city called Houston some years back. And I remember an evening in which we attended some social event in downtown Houston. And on the way back home, we somehow got lost. And it got later and later. And we wound up on a street called Montrose, which was a very culturally flavorful part of Houston. And let me tell you, folks, Montrose at midnight in Houston, Texas, was a sight to behold for a country boy like me. It was pretty wild. Pretty wild. It's not the kind of street that good little boys and girls would want to be on at midnight. Verse 21.
Your choice of words, David, is hilarious.
Well, let's just say, yeah, I returned from that trip wide-eyed. It took me a week to go to sleep, but anyway. So he brought him into his house, and he gave the donkeys feed, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. Here we go again, eating and drinking. As they were making their hearts merry, again, this word is the same word that was used for the time with the father-in-law. They were carousing, eating and drinking, there's nothing wrong with that, but it just goes, it's repetitive. That's what this Levite seemed to live for. As they were doing that, verse 22, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him. And those of you who are familiar with Old Testament language will know that this was not a how do you do greeting situation. The term to know, while it could refer to social intercourse, more typically in a setting like this refers to sexual intercourse. So the old man who brought the Ephraimite, who brought the Levite and his company into his house, they're eating the evening meal before going to sleep when some of the men of the city, some versions say some men, some versions say the men. So whether it's all the men or not, we don't know. In Sodom, it was all the men. Worthless fellows come beating on the door, and they basically say, we want to have our kind of party with your guest. And the man, the master of the house, went out to them, and he said to them, no, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man is come into my house, do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now, violate them, and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing. Well, for those of us in the modern context, it's a little bit hard to figure out which is the more outrageous. But this should ring familiar to those of you who remember the story from Sodom. This is a repeat. What did Lot say? It is not appropriate for you to threaten or harm a guest in my house. That offended the very deepest spirit of Oriental hospitality. Here are my 2 daughters. Here's an alternative. But the men would not listen to him. So the man, that would be the Levite, seized his concubine and made her go out to them. And they knew her, which literally means they raped her and abused her all night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. And her master rose up in the morning. And when he opened the doors of the house and went out to go on his way, behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, "Get up, let us be going." But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his home. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her. He cut her up, limb by limb, into 12 pieces, and he sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. Several things we need to look at. I'm not sure what order. You notice it never says she died. It doesn't actually say that in the Hebrew text. In the Septuagint and in the Vulgate, the old Latin version, those words are actually added. There was no answer, for she was dead. But in the Hebrew, the original text, as far as we can tell, that detail is missing, which leaves us merely to speculate. She was so seriously abused and mistreated that she apparently was not able to even open the door. She fell in front of the door, and there she was found, and she couldn't even answer the voice. It says her master, her husband, master. He was both, of course, because she was a slave wife. So he picks her up. Go ahead, Rhonda.
I wanted to ask, what's the significance of her having her hands on the threshold? Was it sort of like grabbing the horns of the altar, some sort of protection?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I think it is, she was grappling with the last of her life energy at the door. You know, there are stories of people who leave their fingernails in something they're trying to hang on to when they fall. A last act of desperation, a last attempt to reach safety would be my guess. It's kind of a heartbreaking detail. So the man finds her there. She doesn't answer him, and so he puts her on the donkey and takes her home. And there he dismembers her and sends her on a scenic tour of the 12 tribes. Now, I don't know how a story can get much more awful than this, but actually it's going to. This is just the beginning. There's something I want to share with you. I need to read this to you, so let me find it here. The links between this story and the story of the attempted rape of the angels at Sodom are profound. The links are so strong that the one story is virtually a copy of the other story with different characters inserted playing the main roles. Let me illustrate. According to a commentator named Daniel Block. Block. Here are the most obvious links. Number one, a small group of travelers arrives in the city in the evening in both stories. Number two, a person who is himself an alien observes the presence of this company. In one case, Lot is an alien sojourning in Sodom. In the other, an Ephraimite is an alien sojourning in Gibeah. Number three, the travelers have a mind to spend the night in the open square in both stories. Number four, at the insistence of the host, the travelers agree to spend the night in his house instead. Number five, the host washes the guests' feet, which is implied in Genesis 19:3 after the offer of verse 2. Number six, the host and the guest share a meal in both stories. Number seven, depraved men of the city surround the house. Number eight, they demand that the host deliver his male guests to them so that they may commit homosexual gang rape. Number nine, the host protests against this display of wickedness. And number 10, when the protests prove futile, a substitute female is offered or handed over. That's the start. But it gets even weirder. The commentator goes on. He says, the echo of Genesis chapter 19 in this text is intentional. Whoop, no, I'm missing something here. Hang on. Language 534. Yeah, here we go. All the words found in the Genesis account, almost 1/4 of them, 16, occur in the same form in Judges. So the very same words are found in both stories. An additional 24 expressions from Genesis find a close counterpart in Judges with only slight variations. The stories use virtually the very identical language. It gets even weirder. In Hebrew, the number of words in each of these stories is identical, 69 words in both stories. These stories are carbon copies of each other. And this is not accidental. The stupidity of many scholars in the last 50, 60 years has been to say, well, you know, if these stories are so identical, then obviously it was the same account. It was really only one that happened. It's just like a joke, you know, where you have a rabbi, a priest, and a mullah, and then somebody else takes the story and inserts an Irishman, a Dutchman, and a Greek. But it's the same joke. So it was the same story, and they just, you know, reclothed it for use in another story. What such scholars who have training in history but virtually no training in ancient literature fail to recognize is the nature of Hebrew narrative art. Of course, the stories look identical, except for the main characters, and they do so on purpose. The writer of the book of Judges is begging you to make the comparison to what happened in Sodom, not because there was only one story, but because who would ever have guessed that the people of God would end up having the same behavioral dynamics as Sodom? This is the point being made, not that somebody has adapted the Sodom story for another folktale, but the point of the story is to say God's people who were given the law of Moses, who were told, you shall be holy as I am holy, became so degraded and so idolatrous and so Canaanized that in the end, Gibeah became Sodom. That's the point. Daniel Block goes on and he puts it in these rather brutal words. The echo of Genesis 19 in this text is intentional. By patterning this account after the earlier story, the narrator serves notice that whereas these travelers thought they had come home, Finding safety with their own countrymen, they have actually arrived in Sodom. The nation has come full circle. The Canaanization of Israel is complete. When the Israelites look in the mirror, what they see is a nation that may be ethnically distinct from the natives, but which is indistinguishable from them with regard to morality, ethics, and social values. You get what he's saying? Ethnically, they were supposed to be, they're different. They're not Canaanites, they're Hebrews. But ethically, they are Canaanites. Ethnically, they're different. Ethically, they're identical. They have sunk to the level of those nations whom they were commanded to destroy and on whom the judgment of God hung. And in the words of Moses in Deuteronomy 8, 19, and 20, when Israelites act like Canaanites, they may expect the same fate. It's what God told them. He said, if you wind up being like the people I told you to destroy, I'll destroy you too. Ugly. Very, very ugly. Back to the story. Judges 19, verse 30, and all who saw it, all the Israelites in these communities where they saw an arm or a leg or a head or a torso or a thigh bone or an ankle from this woman who had been cut up. All who saw it said, such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak. If the Levite had aimed to get the attention of the nation, he succeeded. Right now, the attention of our nation is turned on Nashville, Tennessee, and the mass shooting that just took place there. Israel did not have evening news or the internet, but I guarantee you the whole nation was stood on its head by what the Levite did. Chapter 20 and verse 1, then all the people came out from Dan to Beersheba, including the land of Gilead. And the congregation assembled as one man to the Lord at Mizpah. This story would appear to have happened after the last story with Micah and the Danites, because notice the phrase here, all the people showed up from Dan, that would be the very north, that would be Bangor, Maine, all the way to San Diego, all the way from Nome, Alaska to Key West, from the north to the south. And the phrase from Dan to Beersheba would not be used here until after Dan had relocated to become the northernmost point, unless they were using an anachronistic phrase, which is a possibility. So the whole nation comes together, basically, at least in the form of their leadership and their army. Verse 2, and the chiefs of all the people, of all the tribes of Israel, presented themselves in assembly of the people of God. Isn't this interesting? Israel has become anything but the people of God, but the name still sticks. They are officially the people of God. Just like officially we still put on our money, in God we trust. Now, what was that stock market quote? So the chiefs, all the tribes of Israel, presented themselves, 400,000 men on foot that drew the sword. By the way, when Israel came into the land and when they left Egypt, there were 600,000 men that drew the sword. It would appear, if this is proportional, that Israel has experienced 1/3 loss in population, just roughly speaking. Now, when it says that all the tribes gathered, that wasn't literally all the tribes. Guess who didn't get invited? Benjamin. The bad guys. Verse 3, now the people of Benjamin heard that the people of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. And the people of Israel said, tell us, how did this evil happen? Can anybody remember a time in the United States when a gang rape would have been national news?
So this has never happened is referring to the gang rape or the cutting of a woman into 12 pieces?
It doesn't specify. That's an interesting question.
Because here he says, what happened? You know, and to suggest that, it says it's the cutting of the person. And you get, and if in fact the culture has become wicked, gang rape seems to me would not be uncommon.
unless it was the first instance of a, Gibeah being ahead of the curve, so to speak. I think, remember Columbine, speaking of school shootings, there are now so many dozens a year that it still surprises me that it's still such a big deal in Nashville, because it's so common now that it's hard to even keep track of all the places. But remember how Columbine was? Do you remember how the whole nation just like screeched to a halt? Like when John Kennedy was assassinated, it was a huge deal. And not that this isn't, but there is no way that what happened in Nashville will retain the attention of the nation the way that Columbine did, because it's way too common. How did this evil happen? Verse 4, and the Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered and said, I came to Gibeah that belongs to Benjamin, I and my concubine, to spend the night. And the leaders of Gibeah rose against me and surrounded the house against me by night. Okay, the story's getting a little embellishment as the Levite retells it. In the first place, we don't really know who killed the woman, do we? We don't know whether she was still alive when the Levite took his knife. We do not know. But let's give him the benefit of the doubt. It says some men, or the men of Gibeah, surrounded the house, but now it's become the lords of Gibeah, the leaders. The Levite's doing his dead level best to implicate the entire town. And surrounded the house against me by night. They meant to kill me. Yes, Rhonda?
You just said it. In the beginning, they wanted to gang rape him. Doesn't mention that they wanted to kill him.
There you go. Of course, based on what happened to the concubine, the outcome likely had a good chance of being the same, but still, he is telling the story just a little bit different, isn't he? He's massaging the narrative. They meant to kill me, and they violated my concubine, and she is dead. It's almost like, they came after me, but I escaped, but they took my woman and they killed her, and I was able to rescue her body later. Well, that's not quite the way it went down, but that's kind of the impression he's leaving.
Brother David.
He's only a Levite, a man of God, a man of the cloth. You really wouldn't expect a lot more truth than from a used car salesman, would you?
Brother David?
Yes.
I'm noticing that verse 20 says, verse 5 says, they violated my concubine and she is dead. It doesn't say, and they killed her.
Right. It remains ambiguous, doesn't it? We don't know. We don't know. She could have been dead while she was sprawled there on the threshold. She could have died. She could have been barely alive, and she could have died on a humpy donkey journey across the landscape to the hill country, or she could have died when the knife severed her parts. We just don't know.
To borrow some of your phraseology, he's stretching the truth till it twangs like a rubber band.
Basically, there are no honorable people in this story, which is where we get by the end of Judges. This is kind of, the decline. We reach a point where honor is scarce. In fact, honor is absent. So he says, verse 6, I took hold of my concubine and I cut her in pieces and I sent her throughout all the country of the inheritance of Israel, for they have committed abomination and outrage in Israel. Now, there's no arguing with that. What the folks in Gibeah did was beyond evil. Basically, there were 4 specific crimes that were attempted, 3 of which were actually done. Number 1, homosexuality, which in this time and place under the law of Moses was a capital offense. What they intended to do should have required their execution according to the law of Moses. Second, rape. Obviously, this was a gang rape. It was meant to be a homosexual gang rape, but when they couldn't get to the man, they settled for the woman. Third, adultery. The woman that they gang raped was married. So adultery. Again, the penalty under the law of Moses for adultery is capital. It is execution. And of course, the fourth crime is murder, because whether or not the Levite finished her off, they killed her. They left her for dead. These were bad folk. Yes, Rhonda?
So I'm trying to find a parallel to try to get my point across. I think what I'm trying to ask is, is he trying to turn the rest of Israel against the Benjaminites to cover the fact that maybe he killed his wife? Kind of like someone in a mystery movie that kills somebody and then sets fire to the house to cover it up.
One of the great friends of a clever director of a movie is ambiguity. You don't give the audience all the answers. That's a possibility. Sometimes a very, very crafty movie scriptwriter leave you wondering. I do think that regardless of whether Levi jumped the gun, was, if you put a mirror under her nose, was she still breathing? The folks in Gibeah were just as guilty of murder as they could be. Now, he might have been too, we don't know, but they certainly were. And he's saying they've got to pay. Israel cannot allow a thing like this to stand. When I think of the horrific headlines across our nation, I wonder how long ago it was that we even had enough capacity for moral outrage. When was the last time we were really willing to tar and feather somebody who deserved it? I don't know. At this point in Israel's history, the Levite was banking on the fact that there was enough outrage to bring justice to those creeps in Sodom. So verse 7, behold, you people of Israel, all of you, give your advice and counsel here. And all the people arose as one man, saying, none of us will go to his tent, and none of us will return to his house. But now this is what we will do to Gibeah. We will go up against it by lot, and we will take 10 men of 100 throughout all the tribes of Israel, and 100 out of 1,000, and 1,000 of 10,000, to bring provisions for the people, that when they come, they may repay Gibeah of Benjamin for all the outrage that they have committed to Israel. They basically said, we are going to punish the city. The city will be held responsible for this. Their crime is capital, and we're going to mete out the sentence. Verse 11, so all the men of Israel gathered against the city, united as one man. Now they are going to do one thing first. Verse 12. And all the tribes of Israel, the tribes sent men through all the tribe of Benjamin, saying, what evil is this that has taken place among you? Now, therefore, give up the men, the worthless fellows in Gibeah, that we may put them to death and purge evil from Israel. Here, they're actually using biblical language. There's a whole section of the book of Deuteronomy where a whole list of capital crimes is detailed point by point. And God, after saying, if this happens, you shall put this person to death, then each section ends with the same phrase. Basically, it goes like this. It says, thus you shall purge the evil from Israel. If evil takes residence in the heart of certain people, you purge the evil. You get it out by destroying its host. One way to kill cancer is to kill the person, right? So they're using biblical language. They're using judicial language to say judgment must be served according to the Holy Writ. And they're giving the people of Benjamin, they're giving the tribe an opportunity to avoid war against the city. They're saying, if you turn these people over to us, then we won't have to go to war and put the city to the sword. You can be honorable, you can step up and do the right thing. But the Benjaminites, you know what they said in reply? They basically said, okay, the men in Gibeah may be SOBs, but they're our SOBs. Hands off. That's what they said. The Benjaminites would not listen to the voice of their brothers, the people from Israel. Instead, the people of Benjamin came together out of the cities to Gibeah to go out to battle against the people of Israel. Instead of turning them over, they lined up shoulder to shoulder with these rapists. Hey, they're Benjaminites. Blood's thicker than water. Bring it on. Well, that's going to be, according to the next verse, 26,000 men, versus an army of 400,000. I can't help but think of that commercial where some skinny nerdy guy with glasses finds himself standing in a ring with what do they call a sumo ring? And there's this giant Japanese on the other side looking meaner than a junkyard dog. And the poor nerd is flipping through a Japanese English dictionary trying to look for I surrender. But what he ends up saying translates as bring it on, fat boy. We're about to have a serious battle, but it's going to be uneven. And we're going to stop right there. It is 6:21. I shall return in about 5 minutes. That will be about 6:26. And we will continue with this ugly, ugly tale. I think, like the Levite, we should eat and drink and make merry.
Yeah. It's so strange. They are horrified that the men raped and killed this woman. There's no horror that the man gave her to them, including the story a lot.
Yes.
Never a word of
Same thing.
Never a word.
Yeah.
And which strange Old Testament epic.
I was thinking about this earlier. Part of that is explained by the sheer power of the hospitality mandate in the East.
Yeah.
And in desperate situations where you figure that you're door A or door B, you've got to do something under that pressure. But part of it also would be that if their society were able to look in the future and see our society, would they not be disgusted to the hilt with us?
Yeah.
So
it's the same way around.
It really is odd. They seem horrific to us, and they probably are.
Yeah.
And yet we're blind to our own.
Yeah. It would be a most interesting conversation with.
Really match.
What's a match? The match game. By the way, in the news app, 1440 mentioned Columbine. Mass killing database reveals trends since 2006. 2,800 have lost their lives. 543 mass killings since 2006. Yeah, there's the map. You know, it's not just that we've become insensitive. It's that it happens almost every day.
It's the sheer
Well, I saw something about the school shootings said I think it said there had been 13 this year in 2022. It's 1 a week.
Yeah.
Is what it averages out, 1 a week.
Isn't bizarre? All right, we're back. Go ahead, Rhonda.
I was wondering, well, first, yes, we're living in a dark time. And you had asked the question about when would a gang rape make national news like what happened here in Israel? Would it have been, this might be fiction, I'm not sure, but the cross and the switchblade? What were those boys accused of?
You know, that might be a good place to put one's finger time-wise. I remember, I think, a number of years ago, the first time, we've heard this so often now, but some horrible crime happened on the subway, and the first time that the bystanders, in New York, literally stood there and did not respond to help, that made big national news. But that was, I think, decades ago now.
1984.
1984, see? And we just reach a point of deadness and hardness.
Hardness of heart.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we have miles to go before we sleep, so here we go. We may not finish out this story tonight, but feel free to ask questions. We have another session and we'll finish up as needed. But basically, like I said, we have two armies that are getting ready to mix it up. Chapter 20, verse 16. Actually, let's go back to verse 15. The people of Benjamin mustered out of their cities on that day 26,000 men who drew the sword, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, who mustered 700 chosen men. And among all these were 700 chosen men who were left-handed. Every one could sling a stone at a hare and not miss. The writer never gets over his delight in referring to Benjaminites, meaning son of the right hand, who were left-handed. But this is also a backhanded way of saying that they're not right. They are off. They're definitely off. But they were terribly good warriors. All these things about, how good southpaw pitchers are or southpaw boxers. These guys were serious warriors. Meanwhile, verse 17, the men of Israel, apart from Benjamin, mustered 400,000 men who drew the sword. All these were men of war. Doesn't seem very equal, does it? Not meant to be. Verse 18, the people of Israel arose and they went to Bethel and they inquired of God, who shall go up first for us to fight against the people of Benjamin? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up first. Then the people of Israel rose in the morning and encamped against Gibeah. And the men of Israel went out to fight against Benjamin, and they drew up the battle line against them at Gibeah. The people of Benjamin came out of Gibeah and destroyed on that day 22,000 men of the Israelites. This is not the direction we expected the story to turn. The little army put it on the big army. Verse 22, but the people, the men of Israel, took courage and again formed the battle line in the same place where they had formed it on the first day. So this is day 2. And the people of Israel went up and they wept before the Lord until the evening. And they inquired of the Lord, shall we again draw near to fight against our brothers, the people of Benjamin? And the Lord said, go up against them. So the people of Israel came near against the people of Benjamin the second day. And Benjamin went out against them out of Gibeah the second day and destroyed 18,000 men of the people of Israel. All these were men who drew the sword. So the big army is just getting lambasted by the little army. It's terrible. The murderers and the rapists and the people supporting them are winning and doing terrible damage. You add these two numbers up and you have 40,000 dead Israelites. Verse 26. Then all the people of Israel, the whole army, went up and came to Bethel and wept. They sat there before the Lord and fasted that day until evening, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. And, by the way, I said the Levite was named. It was not the Levite at the beginning of the story. It is this priest who is named. He's the only one in the entire story who gets a name. Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, ministered before the ark in those days. Now, Phinehas, we know from the book of Joshua and from the book of Deuteronomy, from the book of Numbers. If this genealogy here doesn't skip any generations, then this story had to happen pretty early in the book of Judges, within 100 years of the death of Joshua. Because Phinehas is pictured as being the grandson of Aaron, which can't be too far from the entry into the land. But the thing that is not certain is that in many cases, the Hebrews were not reluctant to skip a generation. You could be the son of, and it could be 2, 3, 4 generations. So, but still, Phinehas, if he's the same guy, has to be pretty early on. And he leads the inquiry, verse 28, shall we go out once more to battle against our brothers, the people of Benjamin, or shall we cease? And the Lord said, go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand. Is this not strange? They ask on the first day, who shall go first? God says, Judah. This takes us back to Judges chapter 1. When they were getting ready to finish conquering the land, they said, who shall go first? And God said, Judah. Doesn't work out too well. 22,000 dead. They go the second day and they ask God first, shall we go? God says yes. They go and they get their butts handed to them again. And so they come again on the third day and they ask a little more detail. Shall we go or shall we stop? What's wrong here, God? Have we messed up? Have we misheard you? And the Lord says, go again. Tomorrow you will succeed. Now, what follows is a very detailed description of this third day of battle. And I'm going to read through the whole thing because it's quite repetitive. So Israel sent men in ambush around Gibeah, and the people of Israel went up against the people of Benjamin on the third day and set themselves in array against Gibeah as at other times. And the people of Benjamin went out against the people, and they were drawn away from the city. And as before, they began to strike and kill some of the people in the highways, one of which goes up to Bethel and the other to Gibeah, and in the open country. They killed about 30 men of Israel. And the people of Benjamin said, they are routed before us as at the first. But the people of Israel said, let us flee and draw them away from the city to the highways. Yes, Rhonda, go ahead.
Another one of my questions.
That's fine.
On the third day, God has his reasons for threes. So I just wanted to know, is there a significance?
Hold that thought. I wonder the same thing, but let's get the rest of the story and then let's come back to that. Don't let me forget it though.
Yes, sir.
So the Benjamites are saying, hey, day 3 is going just like day 1 and 2. We can handle this. And the people of Israel are saying, that's what we want you to think. Come a little further out. Chase us a little farther. Verse 33. And all the men of Israel rose up out of their place and set themselves in array at Baal Tamar. And the men of Israel who were in ambush rushed out of their place from Ma'are-Geba. And there came against Gibeah 10,000 chosen men out of all Israel. And the battle was hard, but the Benjaminites did not know that disaster was close upon them. And the Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and the people of Israel destroyed 25,100 men of Benjamin that day. All these were men who drew the sword. So the people of Benjamin saw that they were defeated. The men of Israel gave ground to Benjamin because they trusted the men in ambush whom they had set against Gibeah. Then the men in ambush hurried in and rushed against Gibeah. The men in ambush moved out and struck all the city with the edge of the sword. Now, the appointed signal between the men of Israel and the men in the ambush was that when they made a great cloud of smoke, my battery just died in my, I'll just have to talk loud. Hopefully you can still hear me. Can you guys hear me on Zoom?
Yes, sir.
All right, I'll just shout a little. I'll pretend I'm in the battle. The signal was when they made a great cloud of smoke rise up out of the city, then the men of Israel who had been running away should turn in battle. Now Benjamin had begun to strike and kill about 30 men of Israel. They said, surely they are defeated before us, as in the first battle. But when the signal began to rise out of the city in a column of smoke, the Benjaminites looked behind them, and behold, the whole of the city went up in smoke to heaven. Then the men of Israel turned, and the men of Benjamin were dismayed, for they saw that disaster was close upon them. Therefore they turned their backs before the men of Israel in the direction of the wilderness, but the battle overtook them. And those who came out of the cities were destroying them in their midst. Surrounding the Benjaminites, they pursued them and trod them down from Nohah as far as opposite Gibeah on the east. 18,000 men of Benjamin fell, all of them men of valor. And they turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon. By the way, this translates as the pomegranate rock. There is a structure on the cliff there that is riven with fissures and caves that go way back into the rock. Kind of like the story out of Tom Sawyer, you know, the caves that go on endlessly. So basically, it was a great place to run in and hide. And it looked on the outside, because of all the fissures, like the open face of a pomegranate fruit. So that's the reason probably for the name. 5,000 men of them were cut down in the highways, and they were pursued hard to Gidom, and 2,000 of them were struck down. So all who fell that day of Benjamin were 25,000 men who drew the sword, all of them men of valor. But 600 men turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon. And they remained at the rock of Rimmon, that is in the caves, for 4 months, which is a bit ironic because that's the same period that the concubine who left her husband stayed with her dad in Bethlehem on the front end of this story, right? And the men of Israel turned back against the people of Benjamin and struck them with the edge of the sword, the city, men and beasts, and all that they found. And all the towns that they found, they set on fire. Basically, he's saying their original problem had been with one city, Gibeah, right? The men of Gibeah had perpetrated this terrible crime, and they had to be called to account. But then the whole tribe of Benjamin lined up with them. And so now the quarrel was not with the men of one city, but with the entire tribe. Benjamin allied themselves, you know, that the friend of my enemy is my enemy. You have become, and by the way, what they're doing here, if you remember back in chapter 1, what was the name of the ritual or the practice that the Israelites were to conduct against the Canaanites? They were to kill them all. We called it Herem, right? H-E-R-E-M, H with a sound, Herem. What we have here is Herem being carried out not against Canaanites, but against their own people. Now, the men from the tribe of Gibeah, from the city of Gibeah, they had committed several capital crimes. God himself seems to be with the Israelites in spite of the fact that they lose 2 out of the 3 days. God himself said, I will be with you. And it says the Lord struck them down. The Lord gave them victory. Those folks in Gibeah needed to die badly, in my opinion. I grew up in Africa, which is a much more, what should we say? They're less refined in some ways. When it comes to violence, they don't at all mind dealing out violence where they feel it needs to be dealt out. If you went back to the Western towns in the old American West, it was very similar. People did not cringe at the idea of dealing with evil head on and very violently. Personally, I kind of like that. I think that if we were much more violent for the violent, in the end, we'd have a lot less violence. but that's a personal opinion. You could disagree with me. You have a right to be wrong. Sorry. Arrogance is one of my finest virtues. Moving on. So they didn't stop. What I'm saying is they did not stop with Gibeah. Now it is civil war, and they go through the whole territory of Benjamin, city by city, town by town, and they come in and they kill and butcher every living thing. Man, woman, child, and beast. And then they burn the towns to the ground. Rhonda, I'm remembering your question, so let's hang it on a hook for just a moment longer here, and we'll I don't know that I have a good answer, but we'll at least take a stab at it. With this many swords in the vicinity, taking a stab seems to be the thing to do.
Yes, sir.
Chapter 21, verse 1. Now the men of Israel had sworn at Mizpah, no one of us shall give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin. And the people came to Bethel and sat there till evening before God, and they lifted up their voices and they wept bitterly. And they said, O Lord, the God of Israel, why has this happened in Israel, that today there should be one tribe lacking in Israel? It seemed like a bit of a stupid question when you just killed a whole tribe, and then you turn around and say, God, why should it be that there's a tribe missing? Well, were you in an alcoholic blackout when you did what you just did? But the question is not, why has this happened? The question is, how did such a situation come to be? One time I was on the road with my son when he was probably about 3, and we stopped for a pit stop. And on the side of the road, we found the carcass of a deer that had attempted to cross the interstate at an inappropriate time. It was so badly damaged and torn up that it was hard to even tell what kind of animal it was. Took us a while to figure it out. Well, my son knew that deer were beautiful creatures. And he started asking, why did the deer die? Daddy, why did the deer die? And so I took him over to the edge of the road and wait till an 18-wheeler was barreling down the hill. And it was close enough when it passed to nearly knock us over with the tailwind, you know. And I said, suppose you were a deer and you tried to cross the road right about now. What would happen to you? He said, I'd be crushed. Said, that's what happened to this deer. But then he kept asking, Daddy, why did the deer die? Why did the deer die? And I kept trying to explain the physics, but he wasn't asking about the physics. I finally realized, what are you saying is, Daddy, what kind of a world is it where a beautiful creature like that can come to such a horrible end? Why did the deer have to die? I mean, he got really upset. This is what the Israelites are asking here, not, I just woke up. How did this happen? It's not the question. The question is, God, how could you let a whole tribe die? How could you let us come to this? Yeah, we had to do what we had to do. But God, how in the world have we come to such a place? Now, by the way, the tribe was not completely extinct. Who's left?
600 eligible bachelors.
There are still 600 warriors crawling about in them their caves that looks like a pomegranate, right? Been there 4 months. Probably getting a little long in the beard, a little unkempt. And the next day, the people rose early and they built there an altar and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. Okay, Rhonda. God seems to support the judgment on the city of Gibeah. But God lets them take a terrible beating in the process. He lets them lose in spite of their having 10 times as many soldiers, right? He lets them lose for 2 days in a row until 40,000 of their number have been killed. Another 30 die at least the following day. Why, if God is all about justice on Gibeah, does he allow Israel to take so much damage in the process? Why wait till day 3? You know what? We may have to hold this over. You're going to have to remember your question, because there's another part to the story that where God changes his approach, where suddenly God does things differently that may help to answer that question. But let me just say this much before we call it a night. I don't think that the people of Mizpah, I don't think that the men of Gibeah who did those awful things were probably a whole lot worse than the people that were bringing judgment on them. I think that the general moral condition of the whole country had become bad enough that God was disgusted with the whole kit and caboodle. Is that a good phrase for a people? Kit and caboodle? You know what I'm talking about, right? You got to look up where that came from. But anyway, when you look at this, the Levite, the man of God in this story, is a piece of crap. Pardon my French. He is awful. He's nearly as callous as the men that rape and murder his wife. The Ephraimite, the one who gives them hospitality when none of the Benjaminites will, he looks like a pretty decent guy on the front end. And then we find out that he is willing to offer not only his own daughter, but he's willing to offer the other guy's wife. He's the one that makes the offer. There is nobody honorable. And I don't know. When I look at the quality of the average American today, I kind of think, okay, here we are. We have created a culture that raises people with a very narrow skill set and no morals at all. We destroyed the family, and we created a values-free system for raising human beings. And when it says the worthless fellows, there were worthless fellows at Gibeah. Do you know how many worthless fellows there are? Do you know, if you were to, I'm using New York because they have a subway, but it could be any city USA. If you got on a subway car, one car with 18 people, 25 people around you, and you just took an average of the moral condition of the people in any given subway car in America. Maybe your estimate's different than mine, but my estimate is that we're a pretty sorry lot for God to redeem or even to tolerate. I'm not saying they're not good people, but I'm telling you that I believe that the average in terms of moral fiber, ethical consideration in our nation has reached a low ebb that makes God want to throw up. I hope I'm wrong. Am I? I think that God allowed 40,000 Israelites to die because they needed to. Is that too blunt? I think God is meting out judgment on the whole nation in this story. And if you think I'm wrong, wait till you see the behavior of the Israelites in the rest of this particular story and tell me then if you don't think they deserved it. Because the rape and the murder is not over, folks. It's just getting started. All right, here we are at 6:50 p.m., which according to the head of our school is quitting time. The Lord bless you all. Sorry to leave you with such a messy story, but it is what it is. And only God can redeem anybody. I guess the good news is that if you're a thief on a cross and you spent your whole life stealing from folks and you look into the eyes of a man who is more than blood and clay and from whom heaven stares out, and you say to him, Lord, remember me when you come into paradise, that there is someone who can still pull your fat out of the fire. remember me. All right, God bless. We'll get new batteries in a new week, and we'll take one more whack at this with our sword. Good night, all.
Thank you, David. Your classes are most interesting.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.